Section: Introduction. In this section, we explore the complexities of neural network loss functions, which are known to be non-convex. Despite this, we often find effective solutions using gradient descent methods, which raises questions since non-convexity can be problematic. A straightforward example of non-convexity is the presence of critical points from embedded subnetworks. We can create a larger network by duplicating hidden neurons from smaller networks, leading to a situation where the optimal loss of any smaller network appears as a series of critical points in the larger network's loss function. Typically, duplicating neurons changes local minima into a line of saddle points, but sometimes this line can also include segments of local minima. Theoretical arguments suggest that local minima are rare, especially in multilayer networks, and that saddle lines are not an issue. We empirically verify that these saddle lines, caused by symmetry, do not pose problems even in lower dimensions. However, we discover that there are many pathways in the loss landscape that run parallel to these saddle lines and lead to local minima at infinity. These minima at infinity are different from those found in separable classification problems. They occur when at least two input neurons become equal at finite values, while their output weights diverge to positive or negative infinity. Our main contributions are I. Identifying and characterizing a new structure in the loss landscape called channels to infinity. E. Demonstrating that gradient-based training frequently reaches these channels from typical random initialization methods. And E. Explaining how these channels enhance the network's computational abilities by functioning as gated linear units. In related work, we note that neuron splitting creates a continuum of critical points. Fukumizu and Amari first mapped the critical points of a neural network's loss function to a line of critical points in a new network with an additional neuron. They also examined the Hessian of the loss along this line and found that local minima appear under certain conditions. If those conditions aren't met, neuron splitting can create strict saddles that allow for escape, which has led to alternative training algorithms that grow networks sequentially. For very wide neural networks, the loss function generally lacks suboptimal minima, but there are families of suboptimal minima in non-overparameterized and mildly overparameterized networks. Neuron splitting can turn these suboptimal minima into saddles in ideal scenarios, and adding a few extra neurons can simplify the optimization process. In the context of the spiked tensor model, a complex structure of saddle points helps gradient flow avoid suboptimal local minima. We also discuss flat regions in loss landscapes, which have been documented in various studies, from symmetry-induced critical points to global minima in overparameterized setups. Empirical findings show that flat regions appear in interpolations between different training solutions, a phenomenon known as mode connectivity, especially after aligning permutations. These locally flat areas can be star-shaped or feature orthogonal tunnels that extend in the parameter norm. Finally, we differentiate the minima at infinity in our study from those in separable classification problems. In linear networks and one-dimensional sigmoidal deep networks trained with a single data point, local minima at infinity do not occur, although they can arise with two data points. We can remove finite norm local minima by adding specific neurons that connect input directly to output and can eliminate local minima at infinity through regularization. To illustrate our key ideas, we focus on neural networks with a single hidden layer and mean-squared error loss. The insights we gain can be generalized to multiple layers and are not dependent on the specific loss function. We define the loss landscape with parameters that include weights and biases, while the input samples consist of multidimensional vectors with a constant term to account for bias. Section Summary. In this section, we explore the non-convex nature of neural network loss functions and identify novel structures in the loss landscape, specifically channels to infinity that enhance computational capabilities. We also confirm that gradient-based training is likely to reach these channels from typical initialization schemes, which differ from traditional local minima at infinity. Section: Neuron duplication introduces lines of critical points. In this section, we explore how duplicating neurons creates lines of critical points in the loss landscape. We begin by examining saddle lines induced by symmetry. Fukumizu and Amari demonstrated that if we have a critical point of the loss function with a certain number of neurons, adding one more neuron leads to a new line of critical points with the same loss value. Specifically, if we have a critical point represented by a set of parameters, then for any value we choose, the parameters of a network with one extra neuron will also be a critical point, maintaining the same loss. We define a line, called the saddle line, that connects these critical points. The stability of these points depends on our choice of parameters and the properties of a specific matrix. If this matrix is either positive or negative definite, we find regions of local minima along the saddle line, which we refer to as plateau saddles. The number of these saddle lines increases significantly as we add more neurons to the network. To investigate the presence of stable regions, we trained various small networks on a two-dimensional regression problem. We found that many saddle lines contain plateau saddles where the gradient dynamics converged. This convergence was evident as networks of different sizes reached the same loss values, indicating they were computing the same functions. We observed that convergence to a plateau saddle occurred with a probability ranging from 10% to 30% across different initializations. We also analyzed the loss landscape around these plateau saddles and found that they are flat regions that can exist in certain segments of the saddle line. At the boundaries of these segments, some properties of the landscape change significantly, indicating a highly degenerate point. In other regions, the properties remain stable. As the number of unique minima can grow rapidly with network size, it becomes impractical to fully characterize them in larger networks. However, we found that adding biases to the network tends to eliminate most plateau saddles. While these saddle lines may not directly cause issues in practical scenarios, they could influence nearby regions in the loss landscape. Next, we examined where gradient descent converges when starting near a saddle line. By simulating the gradient flow dynamics, we identified channels in the loss landscape characterized by diverging output weights of neurons and decreasing distances between their input weight vectors. We refer to these as channels to infinity. To create a saddle line, we trained a network until it reached a local minimum, then duplicated neurons and computed the loss function along a specific direction. We observed that the landscape around the saddle line featured a channel of decreasing loss that extended indefinitely. Through our perturbation analysis, we tracked the gradient flow trajectories and found that only one of the channels was attractive, leading to slow loss reduction. We also calculated a parameter that indicates whether a trajectory is on a saddle line. We conducted experiments with various network architectures and datasets, finding a high probability of encountering channels in all cases. Channels were more prevalent when the target function was complex. The loss distributions between channels and local minima appeared similar, suggesting that channels may not be worse than other minima. We noted that channels could form in any layer of our deep networks and could even exist simultaneously in multiple layers. Additionally, we found that multiple pairs of neurons could create higher dimensional channels. Our tests with different activation functions confirmed the presence of channels across all settings. In summary, we highlighted the unique characteristics of these channels, including their extreme flatness along the saddle line and their increasing sharpness as parameters diverge. We hypothesized that these channels may lead to local minima at infinity. Section Summary. In this section, we investigate how neuron duplication creates critical points in the loss landscape, revealing saddle lines that can contain stable regions called plateau saddles, where gradient dynamics converge. We also identify channels to infinity characterized by diverging output weights and decreasing distances between input weight vectors, suggesting that these structures may lead to local minima at infinity as training progresses. Section. Channels to infinity converge to gated linear units. In this section, we explore how channels converge to gated linear units and their functional role. To understand this convergence, we consider two neurons, labeled as I and J, and redefine them using average weights and differences. The second term in our equation approximates the derivative in a specific direction. As we let the difference approach zero, this approximation aligns with the actual derivative. Notably, This term behaves like a gated linear unit, where the gate is determined by the derivative of the soft plus activation function, and the linear transformation is based on the difference between the two neurons. As we approach the limit, we notice that the input weights converge while the output weights diverge, a pattern we have observed in various solutions. Initially, it is uncertain if the loss function has minimum values at the end of these channels. It might be that the best value occurs at a finite point. However, we have not seen the ODE solvers stop within the channels, as they progress slowly and do not reach very high values of the inverse of the difference, even in small networks. To gather more evidence for optimality at infinity, we implemented a jump procedure that alternates between reducing the difference and integrating the gradient flow for varying durations. This method allowed us to move swiftly along the channels, and we observed a consistent decrease in loss, with parameters appearing to converge and approximation errors diminishing rapidly. While proving convergence to the gated linear unit is complex, we can expand the loss around the point where the difference is zero. This expansion shows that the loss scales with the square of the difference, indicating stability at this point. We also analyzed a simple example involving a network with two hidden neurons, which we used to fit a specific target function. This network has only a few parameters, and we found that combining the error function with its derivative provided a good approximation. To avoid issues with finite data, we based our analysis on the population loss, allowing us to express the loss in terms of normal integrals. We derived optimal parameters analytically and expanded the loss around the zero difference point, revealing critical points in the loss function. We identified stable fixed points at the diverging outputs, emphasizing that the optimal solution lies at a local minimum at infinity. We noted that small weight regularization could hinder finding this optimal solution due to the flatness of the channel. In our example, we observed that stochastic gradient descent and atom could locate the entrance to the channels but struggled to progress further due to minimal loss reduction and potential implicit regularization effects. Section Summary. In this section, we analyze the convergence of channels to gated linear units by reparameterizing neurons and examining the behavior of the loss function as the parameter epsilon approaches zero. Our findings suggest that the optimal solutions lie at local minima at infinity, where the loss decreases slowly, and we demonstrate this through a toy example that highlights the challenges of optimization within these channels. Section Discussion. In this section, we discuss the nature of neural network loss landscapes, which are non-convex but show a surprisingly benign structure during training. We identified a key feature of this structure: extremely flat channels that extend infinitely. These channels can lead to local minima while also providing the network with enhanced computational abilities, specifically through gated linear units that emerge from a specific mathematical approximation. Channels that involve multiple neurons can offer additional capabilities based on higher-order derivatives, although fully understanding these multi-neuron channels is a topic for future research. Our theory was developed using a simple model with a single hidden layer, mean squared error loss, and smooth activation functions. Importantly, the channels to infinity result from the interaction between input and output weights of neuron pairs, and this mechanism is independent of the loss type or the number of layers. We have observed that these channels can be found in any fully connected layer of deep networks, and we anticipate their presence in larger models, including those with transformer or convolutional architectures. However, we are still working on quantifying how often these channels occur in such large-scale settings. Additionally, we are exploring how channels to infinity manifest in networks using the popular non-smooth ReLU activation function. The flatness of minima is associated with better generalization, and the channels to infinity, being flat in some directions and steeper in others, provide a unique perspective on this. Common optimizers tend to get stuck at the start of a channel, making them appear as flat local minima. Even at the beginning of these channels, the network can implement a finite difference approximation of the gated linear unit, which may aid generalization. We also speculate that channels to infinity could help explain recent findings related to star-shaped connectivity in loss landscapes. From a network with a certain number of neurons, we can create orthogonal channels by duplicating each neuron. These channels can seem to originate from the same point if we overlook the parameter space of the additional neurons, which is often a small fraction of the overall high-dimensional space. We believe our new perspective on the loss landscape will be valuable for practical applications where understanding these landscapes is essential, such as in model fusion, adversarial robustness, continual learning, and federated learning.